In 1944, the Empire of Japan was standing on the brink of defeat. After years of war against the United States and its allies, the Imperial Army was losing control over the Pacific Islands one by one. American forces were advancing toward the Philippines, a critical defensive position that Japan was determined to hold at any cost. It was during this desperate phase of the war that a young intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda received the order that would define the rest of his life. Born in 1,922 inches, Wakayama Prefecture, Onoda grew up in a disciplined household. His father was a merchant, and from a young age, Hiroo was taught obedience, loyalty, and devotion to the emperor. In Japan of that era, the idea of duty and national honor outweighed life itself. Young men were raised to believe that a true soldier never surrendered, and that defeat was the ultimate shame. Onoda absorbed these beliefs deeply, convinced that his purpose was to serve and obey no matter the personal cost. In 1942, as the war expanded across the Pacific, Onoda joined the Imperial Japanese Army. He was not destined for ordinary infantry service. His intelligence and determination brought him into a special military training program. He became a candidate for the Nakano School, Japan's elite intelligence and guerrilla warfare academy. There, he was taught how to survive alone behind enemy lines, how to move unseen, how to mislead opponents, and most importantly, how to never surrender. The training emphasized patience, discipline, and the conviction that Japan's soldiers would fight to the very end. By late 1944, Japan's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Entire divisions were being destroyed, and communication between command centers was collapsing. Yet orders continued to be issued, and one of those orders sent Onoda to a small island in the Philippines, Lubang Island, located southwest of Manila. His mission was to conduct reconnaissance, organize resistance, and hinder the expected American invasion. Onoda received clear and absolute instructions. You are not to surrender. You are not to take your own life. You must hold out until further orders arrive. He took those words literally. On the 14th of December 1944, Onoda landed on Lubang with a few other soldiers. The island was covered in thick tropical jungle, surrounded by swamps and steep ridges. Japanese garrisons already stationed there were in poor condition, cut off, undersupplied, and demoralized. When the Americans invaded shortly afterward, the defense quickly collapsed. Within weeks, most Japanese troops were killed or captured. But Onoda and a small group of survivors fled into the mountains. From there, they began their own war, a secret, isolated struggle fought from the shadows. They built hidden shelters, scouted enemy movements, raided supply depots, and avoided all contact with local villagers. For them, the war had not ended, it had merely changed shape. In August 1945, Japan officially surrendered. But in the jungles of Lubang, Onoda knew nothing of it. Planes began dropping leaflets, announcing that the war was over, showing messages from the Japanese government and the emperor himself. To Onoda, this was an obvious trick enemy propaganda designed to flush out the remaining Japanese holdouts. He had been trained to suspect deception and to follow only direct orders from his commanding officers. Since no such orders came, he assumed that Japan was still fighting. Thus began the longest mission of his life. For Onoda and his men, time simply stopped. They continued to live as soldiers, maintaining military discipline and belief in their mission. There were 4 of them at the beginning: Hiroo Onoda, Shigeo Kozuka, Kinchichi Kozuka, and Yuichi Akatsu. They swore never to leave the island or surrender until they received a direct command from the Imperial Army. In the first years after the war, they acted like true guerrillas. They avoided villages, watched local patrols, and collected what little information they could. They survived on bananas, coconuts, and occasionally livestock taken from farms, believing that the villagers were enemies helping the Americans. Every encounter with locals seemed to confirm their suspicions that the war was still being fought. Over time, new attempts were made to contact them. Leaflets, newspapers, even recorded messages were dropped from the sky, all proclaiming that Japan had surrendered. Yet, nothing could convince them. The lack of discipline among villagers, the presence of armed patrols, and the continuing aircraft flights overhead all seemed to confirm their belief that the war continued. Gradually, their numbers dwindled. In 1949, one of the men, Yuichi Akatsu, decided to leave and surrender. When he did not return, Onoda saw this as proof that those who surrendered were captured or executed by the enemy. His distrust only deepened. He believed that he was still part of Japan's last resistance, the last guardian of an unfinished war. By then, the world had moved on. Japan had rebuilt its cities, opened its economy, and entered a new era of peace. But in the dense jungles of Lubang, a handful of men remained, living according to an order given 3 decades earlier, an order that had never been rescinded. The first few years after the war were the hardest, but they also shaped the rhythm of Hiroo Onoda's new existence. Deep inside the jungles of Lubang Island, he and his men lived by strict military order. Each day began with reconnaissance patrols, food gathering, and silent observation of the surrounding area. Every sound in the forest, every airplane in the sky, every distant gunshot could mean the enemy was near. To Onoda, nothing had changed since 1944. The war had simply grown quiet. He believed that the Imperial Army had retreated temporarily and would one day return. Until then, his duty was to hold the island, report any enemy activity, and survive long enough to rejoin Japan's forces when the counterattack began. His group moved constantly, setting up makeshift camps in caves, ravines, and under thick canopies of trees. They collected rainwater, dried fish, and rationed what little rice they found. They mended their uniforms, cleaned their rifles, and polished their bayonets, determined to remain soldiers even as the world outside forgot them. In their minds, surrender was impossible. Surrender meant betrayal. From their earliest training, they had been taught that a Japanese soldier never lays down his arms. For Onoda, that was not just an order, it was an identity. At times, they encountered Filipino villagers. These meetings almost always ended in fear or conflict. Onoda and his men saw the locals as enemy collaborators, while the villagers, terrified of armed strangers appearing from the jungle, saw them as ghosts from a vanished war. Skirmishes broke out, reinforcing the soldiers' belief that they were still behind enemy lines. Years passed. In 1950, Japan was already recovering under American occupation. A new constitution was written, and peace had returned. But the name Hiroo Onoda appeared briefly in Japanese newspapers when Yuichi Akatsu, the soldier who had deserted, turned himself in. He told authorities that Onoda and others were still alive on Lubang, still convinced that the war was ongoing. Search parties were sent, planes dropped, leaflets, and recordings from Onoda's family were broadcast by loudspeakers through the forest. They urged him to come home, assuring him that Japan had surrendered long ago. But for Onoda, these were tricks of the enemy. The voice could be imitated, the letters forged, the photographs faked. His mind had built an unbreakable wall. Everything not witnessed directly was deception. In the dense tropical jungle, time lost meaning. Seasons blurred into one another. Rain fell endlessly, and the heat never relented. The men learned to live with insects, disease, and hunger. Yet Onoda never doubted his mission. He kept his small notebook, wrote brief reports of enemy movements, and imagined that one day he would hand them to his superior officers. In 1952, the Japanese government made another attempt. They sent letters from Onoda's family, photographs, and newspapers printed after the war. But again, he dismissed them. The paper, he believed, could have been planted by American intelligence. No soldier trained in counter-espionage could afford to be deceived. By the late 1950s, the group was down to 3 men: Onoda, Kozuka, and Shimada. They were gaunt but strong, surviving on bananas, coconuts, and the occasional cow taken from farms. Each raid convinced them that the island was still contested territory. When villagers shouted at them to surrender, Onoda interpreted it as an enemy ruse. In 1959, newspapers once again mentioned their names, but interest faded quickly. Japan was experiencing an economic miracle, rebuilding its cities and industries. The lost soldiers were considered tragic remnants of another era. Most assumed they were long dead. In 1964, 20 years after the war's end, the Tokyo Olympics symbolized Japan's rebirth. Television broadcast images of a modern, peaceful nation to the entire world. But far away, on a forgotten island, Onoda was still cleaning his rifle and checking his ammunition, waiting for orders that would never come. Then, tragedy struck again. In 1954, Shimada was killed in a skirmish with local police. Onoda buried him with military honors. A decade later, in 1972, Kozuka, his last companion, was shot and killed by Philippine soldiers during an encounter near a rice field. After that, Onoda was completely alone. Now he lived not just as a soldier, but as a ghost of another time. His uniform was patched, his boots made from bark, his rifle still functional. He kept his weapon oiled and his resolve unbroken. He built small fires at night, writing in his reports about enemy patrols and local resistance activity. For Onoda, surrender was still not an option. His emperor could not be defeated. His mission was still active. In his mind, the war was still being fought, and he was still a loyal intelligence officer of the Imperial Army. The world had changed completely. Japan was a peaceful industrial nation. The United States and Japan were allies, and the Philippines had long been independent. But on Lubang Island, in the silence of the forest, one man continued to live by the words he had been given in 1944. Do not surrender. Do not take your own life. Hold your position until further orders arrive. And those orders had never come. By the early 1972s, the name Hiruo Onoda had become a legend, a rumor that seemed more like a myth than history. Locals on the Philippine island of Lubang still spoke of a lone Japanese soldier who raided fields, stole rice, and fired at those who came too close. For many, he was a ghost story, a relic of a war that had ended decades ago. Yet, the reports continued. Cows were found slaughtered, storage huts burned, and gunshots echoed at night. The authorities dismissed it as local banditry, but some older villagers insisted it's still him. In 1972, when Shigeo Kozuka was killed during an encounter with police, the mystery returned to international headlines. Newspapers across Japan reported that his companion, the legendary officer Hiruo Onoda, might still be alive somewhere on the island. Many doubted it. 30 years was too long. How could anyone survive in isolation for so long? But for Onoda, nothing had changed. The death of Kozuka only deepened his sense of duty. Now, completely alone, he continued to move through the dense forest, as he always had, evading patrols, observing from the shadows, and recording imaginary enemy movements in his worn notebook. His clothes were shredded and patched with vines. His rifle, carefully maintained, still worked perfectly. In Japan, a young adventurer named Norio Suzuki read about Onoda's story and became fascinated. Unlike the officials who had long given up hope, Suzuki decided to find the missing soldier himself. He believed that somewhere in those jungles, Onoda was still waiting for orders that would never arrive. In early 1974, Suzuki arrived in the Philippines and began his search. He walked through the same paths where farmers once feared to go, leaving small notes written in Japanese, offering peace. Weeks passed. Then, one morning, As Suzuki moved quietly near a riverbank, a figure appeared in the distance, thin, dressed in tattered army clothes, holding a rifle that gleamed faintly in the sunlight. Suzuki had found him the last soldier of the Second World War. For Onoda, the sight of a stranger was not unusual. Over the decades, he had encountered many farmers, policemen, hunters, but he always saw them as part of the enemy. Yet something about this man was different. He was alone, unarmed, and spoke with calm gestures. Onoda remained cautious, retreating into the trees, observing for days. Suzuki's words, spoken softly in Japanese, echoed through the forest. They spoke of peace, of a Japan that no longer fought, of a world that had changed. But Onoda's mind was still bound by the same command from 1944. He could not accept surrender without a direct order from his superior officer. That was the law of the Imperial Army. To him, every message, every leaflet, every visitor could be a deception. When Suzuki returned to Japan, he brought undeniable proof photographs of Onoda, alive and in uniform, still carrying his weapon. The images stunned the world. Television and newspapers across the globe reported the discovery of a man who had refused to surrender for nearly 3 decades. The Japanese government quickly began preparations for what would become one of the most extraordinary missions in history to formally relieve a soldier of his duties 30 years after the end of the war. Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had long since retired and was living a quiet life as a bookseller in Japan. When he received the request to travel to the Philippines, he agreed immediately. Only he could deliver the words that Onoda had been waiting for since 1945. In March 1974, Major Taniguchi landed on Lubang Island with a small delegation. They ventured into the jungle, guided by local police and Suzuki himself. After days of searching, they finally reached the place where Onoda was hiding. When Taniguchi stepped forward in his old uniform and saluted, Onoda emerged from the forest, his rifle in hand, his posture rigid, his eyes still sharp and alert. It was then that the moment the world had been waiting for finally arrived. In a calm, measured voice, Taniguchi read the order. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, and all combat operations had ceased. He was officially releasing Hiroo Onoda from his duties. Onoda stood silently for a long time. The forest around them was still, as if listening. Then, slowly, he bowed, unfastened his weapon, and handed over his sword. For the first time in 30 years, he laid down his arms. When he walked out of the jungle, the cameras of the world were waiting. He was dressed in a faded Japanese uniform, his cap still intact, his rifle polished and functional. He looked more like a figure from another century than a man of the modern world. Reporters wept, soldiers saluted, and millions of Japanese citizens watched in disbelief as the last soldier of World War II finally returned home. For Onoda, the moment was both liberation and loss. The world he had believed in was gone. The Japan he returned to was no longer the one he had fought for. It was modern, industrial, peaceful. The values he had lived by had faded into history. But the discipline and loyalty that had kept him alive for 30 years also made him what he was, a soldier who never broke his word. That day, the 9th of March, 1974, marked the true end of World War II, not in history books, but in the heart of one man. When Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, the world welcomed him as both a relic and a hero. Photographers surrounded him as he stepped off the plane, still wearing his faded uniform, his cap tilted just right, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The sight was surreal, a man who had continued fighting a war that ended before many of those watching were even born. For Onoda, the noise of Tokyo was overwhelming. Skyscrapers, electric lights, cars, and television, the city he had known was gone, replaced by a modern world he could barely recognize. Japan was no longer the empire he had served. The emperor was now a constitutional figurehead, and the people lived in peace, pursuing prosperity instead of war. During interviews, Onoda spoke calmly, without emotion. He explained that he had only done his duty. He had followed orders. The war, he said, had never truly ended for him until the moment his commander released him. There was no regret in his words, only the conviction of a man who had lived by an unbroken code. Yet behind that calm exterior was a man displaced in time. 30 years of jungle life had made him a stranger in his own country. He moved cautiously, as if expecting to be watched. The constant hum of the city unsettled him. Crowds of people and flashing lights reminded him that he no longer belonged to the world he had once fought for. The Japanese government granted him a full military pension and honors for his endurance. Many viewed him as a national symbol of loyalty. Others saw him as a tragic example of blind obedience. The public was divided, but everyone agreed that his survival bordered on the impossible. Onoda visited his family, now old and frail. He also met with the families of those who had served and died beside him on Lubang. He expressed sorrow that he had not been able to bring them home. To the Japanese people, he became a living reminder of a past that most wanted to forget, the unwavering discipline of the old Japan, bound by duty above all else. Despite the fame, Onoda struggled to adapt. He tried living quietly, but the pace of modern life was alien to him. In 1975, seeking solitude, he moved to Brazil, where he bought land and raised cattle. He said he wanted to live in peace, surrounded by nature, the only world that still felt familiar. Years later, he returned to Japan occasionally to speak to young people about endurance and belief, but his tone was never one of glorification. He reminded them that devotion without reason could destroy as much as it could preserve. In the final years of his life, Onoda came to represent more than a soldier. He symbolized an era of conviction and extremity, a time when faith in one's duty could outlast nations and generations. For historians, his story became proof of how deeply ideology can shape a person and how long the shadow of war can linger. Hiro Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. His life had stretched across two Japans, one born of empire and sacrifice, and another built on peace and progress. When he passed, flags were lowered, and tributes poured in from around the world. For the people of Lubang, for whom his presence had once meant fear, his name had become part of legend. He was, in every sense, the last soldier of World War II. For 30 years, he had obeyed a single command. And when he finally laid down his weapon, it marked not just the end of one man's war, but the closing of a chapter in human history, a reminder that even in peace, the echoes of duty can last a lifetime.